I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer at Gold Derby, and I'm joined today by Steven Krueger, who plays Coach Ben in season 3 of Yellowjackets. And Steven, I want to jump right ahead to the question that's still on everyone's mind, which
Uh-oh.
is, did Ben actually burn down the cabin? Because we don't get a definitive answer to that in season 3, but I read that you kind of made a conscious decision as the actor playing the part that he did perhaps burn down the cabin. So, can you talk about when you made that decision and how you arrived at it?
Yeah, okay, we're really starting off with the heavy hitter questions here.
Yeah.
Hold my feet to the fire, as they say. Um, yeah, it was a decision that I made. I work with a wonderful acting teacher named Gregory Berger, who I've really worked with for a large part of this series. And so oftentimes we'll sit down at the beginning of every season and really before each episode, and we just kind of talk through the script. We look through all the different scenes, and one of the big burning questions, pun intended, of course, in my mind going into this season was I knew we weren't going to get an answer from the writers. Like I knew that they intentionally wanted to keep it vague and ambiguous, just because that's a good part of storytelling, I think, especially with the dynamics of the girls. So I had to make a conscious choice of like in my own mind, do I think that I did this or not, and then why? What were the motives behind it or not? And to me, the most interesting choice and the most interesting kind of way to create the character and the arc for this particular season was, yeah, I actually do think that I burned down the cabin, but I don't think that I did it with the intention of actually murdering them. I think that
Mm-hmm.
part of what I saw at the end of last season was this group of girls who at one time were this really cohesive team that worked together, that all liked each other, and they had their problems, of course, but they've been figuring out a way to survive. And what I saw was that was starting to decline, right? That situation was starting to become very, very fraught. And so in my mind, I was actually doing them a favor to try to kind of bring them all back together, unite around this one common tragedy. And whether they figured out that I did it or not, who knows? I never planned on being caught by them. But I think in my head, if they no longer had a place to live, then they would have to come together as a unit again and learn how to be a team. And I think that that ultimately would serve them in their survival in the end. So I thought that that was kind of an interesting thing to have in the back of my mind. Again, none of that is scripted. None of that is what the
Right.
writer intended. But just as an actor, I always think it's fun to go a little bit beyond what the actual text of the scripts are.
This is a particularly interesting choice, especially if we think about it as a favor, as you said, because it's a favor that could have resulted in, or could have gone horribly wrong. It's a favor that could
Sure.
have resulted in mass casualty, which I don't think Ben would have been able to live with. That's something that would have tormented him. And I have to believe that if we're to believe that this is true for the sake of this conversation, I have to believe that this thought weighed on Ben in that period between season 2 and 3 that we don't actually get to see, but we know he spent in complete seclusion. So, what do you imagine that time was like for Ben, especially again, if we're to believe that he actually set the cabin on fire?
Yeah, I mean, that was another thing that I played with a lot going into this season. I mean, we see the contrast right at the beginning of the season, right? And they even did it in the way that they shot it, where, they put these kind of beautiful, like gold colored filters on the lens a little bit and did some work in the color process to
Yeah.
kind of girls' lives look like they were living their best lives as much as they can be when they're stuck out in the wilderness. But they had really come together. They had built this whole little community. They had shelter. They had food. They were thriving in a way. And then you cut to Ben, and he is truly struggling. I mean, here's a man who's been on his own now for 6 months, trying to scrounge up whatever food he can, while also trying to stay very clandestine, stay hidden, stay away from these girls, just hoping that some sort of rescue ends up coming. That does some things to a person's brain, just psychologically. And so I toyed with that idea a lot of just what is it like to be in complete and utter isolation while also having to be so aware of your surroundings and so just kind of on all the time, right? He couldn't relax. There was never a time when he could just kind of lounge around. Not only did he have to find his own food and, of course, survive, he also had to worry about them. Were they out looking?
Exactly.
Were they hunting him? Did they just forget about him and they're going to let him live peacefully? All of that, I think, is going through his mind on a really daily basis. And so, yeah, that's why you see early in those episodes, he's lost it a little
He's
bit.
lost it.
He truly has lost it a little bit. And I gotta say, like, as an actor, I think a lot of actors would tell you this. That's a hard thing to do, just from like a performance standpoint. Like you don't want to get into caricature. You want to keep things as grounded and as authentic as possible, especially for a show like this, where everything, even though the circumstances themselves are crazy, all of the performances are so real, and that's kind of what we
Absolutely.
as a show. So that's a hard thing to pull off, and it take a lot of work to get there.
There's a moment in the third episode when Mari's in the cave after he's kind of taken her captive, where he's like talking to himself. Do you think that he's like talking to Paul in what is another one of his like hallucinations or daydreams, maybe even induced by the cave gas, or what do you think is going on there?
To me, it's like the actual answer based on the writing and the story that we ultimately end up seeing is this gas that is kind of seeping through, these fumes that are kind of seeping through this cave system. That's ultimately getting to him. You're exposed yourself to a certain amount of that for days and days and weeks and months. Yeah, he is losing it. Like there's actually like some sort of chemical imbalance going on in his head. For me, I did. You nailed it. I kind of hearkened it back to where we were in season 2, where I was having these hallucinations and these dreams. And I was talking to Paul. And so I think that
Right.
we left it vague enough where the audience still had some guessing to do. But in my head, it was a very specific conversation that I was having.
And is there anything you're willing to share about the specific conversation, or is it like too far removed at this point?
It honestly is like we shot it so long ago that I don't remember. I mean, I could pull out my script and like I guarantee I would have the entire conversation kind of written out because that's the other hard thing, when you're only it's like doing a phone call almost,
Yeah.
when you're not actually getting the lines on the other side of the phone call and you're just saying your own lines. That's a hard thing to do. And so I do remember I had written out a conversation. I knew exactly what I was responding to, and so that just made it easier kind of for me to pull it off in that setting.
We get to see these really great scenes between you and Alexa Barajas, who plays Mari, in the third episode, in which both of the characters are quite vulnerable in a way that we haven't necessarily seen before, especially from Mari. Ben certainly lays himself bare quite a bit here. We don't necessarily know how honest Mari is being, but Ben certainly is very raw and very honest in these scenes. So what do you think? What do you make of this Ben Mari dynamic? And do you think there's anything specific to Mari that makes Ben comfortable enough to open himself up like that?
When I first read that episode, it was such a delight because Alexa and I truly like hadn't gotten much of a chance to work just like solo one on one. I'd gotten an opportunity with some of the other girls, but Alexa and I had kind of only existed in group scenes, and so really for the entire first few episodes of the show, I was very separated from the rest of the cast, and I make the joke that it started to feel like the Ben Scott show for a little while because I was on
Right.
set kind of by myself or maybe with one other actor, and it was really fun. It was a really cool experience to kind of focus in on some more intimate scenes like that. Ben has lost it a little bit. So I'm not entirely sure it was a result of like who he was talking to specifically. I think the fact that he was able to talk to anybody, a real live human being. And there is something interesting, I think. The writers were very intentional about which girl they chose to put in that scene with Ben, because really, in theory, they could have taken anybody and kind of plopped them down. I think because of the history that Ben and Mari have with each other, where it's a very kind of hostile, contentious, not just the backstory we get from their time back in Civilization, but also the scenes that we've seen in the groups where she really kind of goes at him and he snaps back at her. So there's a little bit of tension, a lot of tension between these two characters. And I think that sometimes, just like in life, you have tension with people, and then when you get into like a very dire situation, all that shit just goes away. It just completely melts away because it's not important anymore, and you really just open up naturally. I think we do that as human beings, and so this was a case of that where I think we both had a very honest, very real moment, maybe in spite of ourselves and in spite of what we would otherwise do in another setting.
I also like these like small details that we get about Ben's life, obviously throughout the entire show, but especially in this conversation, the fact that he loved frozen burritos from 7-Eleven, or that he saw Dave Matthews Band, I think 3 times, he said. I just love like these small, tiny details, these very specific details. They just add so much to the character. What's like your reaction when you get these small details, especially like in this episode? Did any of that like catch you by surprise, or is that just something that made a lot of sense to you?
It's so par for the course with the writers that we have. I mean, look, the show started with Ashley Lyle and Bart Nickerson, who I have known for a long time. I worked with them on my first show back in the days on the CW. It was also their first show. I mean, truly from the very beginning, they're just such talented writers. And one of the things that I love about them, and as soon as I saw the pilot episode for Yellowjackets kind of come into my inbox and I read it, I said, this is so Ashley and Bart. And the reason is they write scripts like novels where there's so much detail. It's not necessarily even in the dialogue all the time, but even just in the stage direction and the backstory that you get in these scripts, they truly write like they are writing a short novel. And so they build the world, and so much to the point where when you it's so easy to visualize exactly like what you were doing. Like I could see myself driving to 7-Eleven on the way home from school and like grabbing one of those burritos. And it's a treat, you know, when you work with writers like that, because so much of the work is done for you, and then you just get to let go of it all and just kind of play once you get on set, because they built this really vivid, specific world for you.
Ben lets Mari go, and then this leads to him being caught and being put on trial by the Yellowjackets. And it's really interesting to me to think about this trial, because I think Ben's testimony can be read as truthful, regardless of whether you believe he burned down the cabin or not. But there's still a difference between someone who is actually innocent and someone who's guilty delivering that testimony. So given the decision that you made about Ben early on in the season, you know, about him potentially having set the cabin on fire, how did you approach that speech?
So this was a big inflection point for me in the season, because yeah, we get to, you know, it's funny, you always deal with like the story that you're creating in your mind that's not in the script, and then you have to reconcile that with what actually is in the script, right? And you don't want to just like abandon the story that you've come up with in your mind, that you've been playing with this entire season. So I worked really hard on this particular inflection point, and what I came up with was, again, there's the basic decision, right? Do I really want to live, or do I want to die? You know, like, because I think that's a fair question at this point. He's been through hell.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think anybody would fault him for saying like, I'm done. I'm ready to give up. Please kill me. Again, to me in the moment, that felt a little too simple. It didn't feel like a rich enough story. So what I really did was, what am I trying to do? And this is kind of something that I played with throughout the back half of my storyline this season, was what am I really trying to do with these girls, right? Like, do I need to say anything to them? No, I could just keep my mouth shut and let them do whatever they want. And we actually came up with a really fun thing that I enjoyed playing with the entire second half of my arc this season, which was, I want these girls to have to make the hardest decision of their lives.
Mm.
Whatever they end up doing with me, whether they kill me, whether they keep me alive, whether they keep me shackled in this animal pen, I want it to be the hardest decision they ever have to make. And the reason for that is because that's going to expose who they truly are, right? It's going to bring out their true characters. And one of the big regrets that I think Coach Ben has throughout his life is that he had to live behind a mask, you know, and he chose to live behind a mask for so much of his life. And he doesn't want that for anybody else. That is one of the biggest failures of his life, one of the biggest regrets that he has. And he's still in this mode where he thinks he can teach these girls something. He thinks he can leave them with something. And that's kind of what I chose to leave them with. Make the hardest decision possible, strip down the mask, just be the people you are. If you're savages, fine, be savages, but don't hide.
He tells Misty that it's basically a farce, right? That he's already lost the trial. There's no point in even holding it. And we know, like you said at this point, that Ben has already lost a great portion of his will to live, right? He's more alive than he is living at that point. Did he go out there and defend himself because there's part of him that maybe thinks, oh, I can still survive. I can somehow get back home. But now I think it makes more sense to think of it as, oh, he wants these girls to kind of face who they actually are, which I think is incredibly fascinating, a much more interesting version.
Anytime that I thought the trial was like going in my favor, I would do little things that maybe made me seem a little bit more suspicious. And anytime I thought that it was going not in my favor and they were thinking I was guilty, I would really try to pour it on that I was innocent, just to kind of keep that middle ground where it wasn't, you know, I didn't want it to be a unanimous, like, yes, he's definitely innocent, or yes, he's definitely guilty. And, you know, the effect ended up being that they really tore each other apart over this trial.
Yes.
The major inflection point in the season.
One moment that I especially love is when he kind of apologizes to Shauna for not being there when she gave birth, and then kind of likening himself to his parents, saying, you know, I left you the way my parents left me. Is that something, do you think he's being truthful, or is that something that you think is actually, you know, in his past? And if so, what did you make of that? I'm sure you've come up with a lot about his family life. There's also you know, quite a bit that we've learned about it, but how did you kind of incorporate that information into your characterization of them?
There's a funny story behind that particular moment in the scene. I do think it was a very authentic moment. So what had happened last season in season 2 is during the episode, you know, during that speech in the trial, I'm basically apologizing for kind of abandoning Shauna as she's going through this very challenging birthing process, right? Where she ends up losing the baby, and I'm the one adult in the room, and I kind of cower and run away to my room, and I basically vacate, you know, the entire situation. When we shot that episode last season, that's not actually what happens. There was some scenes that were actually cut from that episode. just for time. And, as a TV fan, I'm sure you know that stuff happens all the time,
all the
especially
time.
on the show. So we have so many characters, the episodes naturally end up being much longer than they can be. And so you have to go in and figure out where to cut things. So what had happened in that episode initially was I actually did find some semblance of purpose where I took care of Javi during the whole birthing episode because he was really scared. He didn't know what was happening. And so I kind of invited him in. We played cards. I soothed him. I comforted him. And that kind of ended up being the way that I could help the most. Well, when we cut all of that out, all of a sudden, to me, the disappointing thing was it changed really the entire
Right.
fundamental nature of this character from a guy who was like trying to help and trying to, have a positive influence, even if he didn't always nail it, to a guy who truly was just like, fuck you guys, I'm out, And that really does change the nature of who this guy is. And so I mentioned that to our showrunners. I said, hey, I know things have to get cut for time, but also I really do think that messes with who this character has been this entire time. And to their credit, they kept that in the back of their mind all the way through this episode. So they put that part in there as a way of me saying, hey, you know what? I know what I did. I know that it was messed up and I am sorry. That's not who I am. Here's the reason why. So it was a really nice, when I read that the first time, I honestly cried a little bit because I was like, that is such a brilliant way of remembering this one tiny little thing that in the overall scheme of things didn't really matter, but it mattered to me. And I think it made a big difference for the character. And it ended up playing so beautiful. And it was really quite an easy moment for me to play too, because I just stared into Sophie Nalise's big doe eyes, and it just got me every single time.
For Ben, things kind of get worse and worse and worse after this trial. His condition just worsens. Yeah, it goes downhill very fast. And because after he's found guilty, he's forcefully kept alive by the Yellowjackets due to Akila's vision, to the point where there's just not much of him left anymore, not emotionally, not physically. And I know that you were told ahead of time or early on where Ben's storyline was headed. So that kind of gave you the opportunity to lose some weight and to kind of grow out your beard. So talk about how that process, that experience helped you go to those depths of despair that Ben is taken to in the final weeks or even months of his life.
It was such a pleasure. I mean, I've had the unfortunate experience of dying in many shows that I worked on, and so I kind of knew the deal. And to be able to get a heads up, months in advance of when we started shooting, and also kind of a really good overview of what the arc was going to look like for Ben this season. It really allowed me to do some planning way in advance and kind of figure out how do I want to craft this storyline. Every actor is a little bit different, as I'm sure you know. Like some people don't like to know anything that their character doesn't know, right? They like to find out their character. For me, I'm always somebody who likes to have as much information as possible. So give me all the information you have. Let me, as the actor, kind of decide, how do I want to craft this arc? How do I want to build this story throughout the course of the season? The weight and the beard, the physical appearance of Ben this season, I think was really important. Not just to kind of show the progression of the timeline, that we're out there, but also his physical and mental state alone. I read this great interview with Bradley Cooper years and years and years ago. He did that movie American Sniper, where he played a military guy, and he put on a lot of weight for that role. And he talked about the fact that he had never kind of lived and existed at that weight before. And so he would, just experience the world in a completely different way. Like he would be walking down the street and accidentally bump into somebody, and like a normal sized human being would just kind of like bounce off of him like a fly because he was so big. And that does something to your mental state as well, when you exist in the world like that. So for me, I was like, well, this is the exact opposite. If I'm able to kind of like trim down and lose some weight and just feel that, not just physically, but also mentally affect the performance. And it truly did. I think throughout the season, I felt times where I was surrounded by these girls, and where there might have been a time earlier in the series where Ben felt like even on one leg, he maybe could have overpowered these girls. That was certainly no longer the case this season. I felt physically weak and intimidated by these girls. And I think that kind of bled its way into a lot of the scenes that we ended up doing in the back half of the season.
He obviously asks Natalie to put him out of his misery many times. And we know that she's kind of his kindred spirit, right? Out there, she's kind of the last person that he really trusts in the wilderness. But how much of him asking her to kill him or to give him the tools so that he can do it himself is also him thinking, Natalie is the last person out here who has a moral compass. So maybe I can kind of guilt trip her into killing me, because, how much of it do you think is him using her good-heartedness to kind of get what he wants? Because obviously we feel bad for him, But at the same time, I was thinking it kind of hurts to see her be put through this. So what do you think is going in Ben's mind there?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. This was, the very first question I had when I found out that Ben was going to die this season. I said, well, obviously, how does it happen, and then who does it? It had to be somebody killing him. It couldn't just be he died of natural causes. And I was like, who does it? And if they said anybody besides Natalie, I was going to be very upset. And I think you nailed it. That it was really important that she, we have seen her kind of falter a little bit as the leader of this group. And so this was going to be kind of the final nail in the coffin. And also, it makes so much sense. We saw Juliette Lewis playing the older version of Natalie in the present day, and just truly how much trauma she had been through, right? Like we've alluded to it
Yeah.
the entire show, but I don't think
Mm.
anybody actually realized until now just what she had gone through
Yeah.
out in the wilderness. And like now, to me, it makes so much more sense why she was as messed up as she was for all of those years in between.
Mm.
She literally murdered somebody, even though it was a mercy killing, and because of that, she was kind of dethroned as the leader of the group. And yeah, it just it plants one of those seeds that sets off all the events that happen later in the show. Which, again, on a show like this, you've got two different timelines. You have to make things connect, right? You have to have that
Exactly.
issue and fiber, and this was a big piece of that puzzle.
And I actually do want to finish things up here. Want to talk about the actual death scene,
Yeah.
and shooting it with Sophie Thatcher, because I really love some of the choices that you make in the scene. For example, how Ben kind of perks up when Natalie walks into the camp with the knife in her hand, because you can just see him being like, I would finally being put out of my misery.
Beauty of having Natalie be the one who kind of commits this final act is that it got to be Sophie Thatcher and I together. And I think from the very first time we were on set together and had a scene of our own, we realized that we're very similar actors, just in the way that we kind of approach the craft, the way we feel about it, our enthusiasm for like the nitty gritty work that actually gets done. And
Mm-hmm.
so that was, working with Sophie Thatcher throughout this series has been one of the easiest things for me, because I can do all my work on my own at home. And then as soon as I show up to set, I know that I don't have to worry about any of it. I know that the two of us are going to be locked in with each other. And that's exactly how this scene went down. Obviously, I had pored over this scene and thought about every angle that you could possibly think about it from. What was he thinking? What was going through his mind each step of the way? And the second that the cameras were up and we were on set, I forgot all of it. I completely let all of it go. And Sophie and I just kind of like played off of each other and looked into each other's eyes. And it was so easy. It truly was. It was a grueling scene to shoot. It was challenging in the sense that it was physically draining and emotionally draining, but it all just happened so naturally. And that was a very common experience working with Sophie Thatcher on set. So I'm very excited to have the opportunity to hopefully work with her again someday. I think that would be very fun.